This is a lecture review video of the events leading to the American Revolution and then the American Revolutionary War itself, including the Peace of Paris that ended the war. We can date the events of the American Revolution beginning in 1763 with the end of the French and Indian War and the Peace of Paris that ended that war, and the events leading to the war itself, and then finally the other Peace of Paris that ended the American Revolutionary War in 1783. A very critical 20-year period in American history, and a valuable question to ask ourselves in this period is, at what point are the Americans moving towards resistance towards British imperial policies? At what point are they moving towards rebellion? And at what point are they moving towards revolution? I've found it extremely valuable to think of the events, particularly leading to the war, in the form of a timeline. Frequently, the AP exam will ask questions about these events leading to American independence. And so if you know a timeline of the events, that's a really great resource to help you answer any question along those lines. It's appeared that way many times on the AP exam. So, beginning our review in 1763, we left off the colonial period talking about the British policy of salutary neglect. This is a nickname given to the absence of British attention and a lot of laws and policies directed towards the Americans. The Americans really are becoming more and more self-sufficient and really think of themselves as separate from England and self-governing, even though they certainly see themselves as Englishmen. The exception to the policy of salutary neglect would be the Navigation Acts, which was a mild attempt to regulate colonial trade. But of course, it is frequently violated by smugglers. The worst, of course, is John Hancock, who is the richest man in New England. So with the end of the French and Indian War and the Peace of Paris, Britain is saddled with an enormous debt by the end of the war. It costs a lot of money to send troops to the New World and also occupy forts in the interior to enforce the Peace of Paris. And so as a result, the British debt equals 140 million pounds after the French and Indian War. In an effort to retire the debt, the British begin a series of taxation policies against the Americans that they weren't particularly used to. One is the Sugar Act of 1764, which could be one of the first events on your timeline. The Sugar Act wasn't particularly new, but it was going to be a tax that was going to be enforced in order to an effort to raise money to retire the debt. In 1765, the Parliament also passes the Quartering Act, which required colonial citizens to quarter or house and feed British soldiers in colonial homes, which often engendered a lot of resentment. What attracted much more attention was the Stamp Act of 1765. The Stamp Act required that all legal transactions be conducted with a stamp that would be purchased. So this is everything from marriages and divorces and a purchase of land, deeds, wills. All of these documents had to have an official stamp on them. So there are immense protests throughout the colonies, most famously in Boston with the emergence of the Sons of Liberty, generally wealthy Bostonians who begin to protest these policies, but they are throughout the colonies. Leader of the Sons of Liberty in Boston is Sam Adams. He's writing editorials frequently in the Boston Gazette under an assumed name and criticizing British imperial policies and often stirring up the mob. As a result, you have mob activity in the streets led by the likes of Ebenezer McIntosh, who was a shoemaker. And often these traditional riots in Boston lead to more vocal attacks against the Parliament and colonial officials. You also see violence against the stamp collectors, such as Andrew Oliver in Boston, who is hanged in effigy. The stamp collector in Connecticut is buried alive until he agrees not to collect the stamps anymore, and then they remove him from his would-be grave. The scene of a lot of the popular protests in Boston is the Liberty Tree, this very significant tree in downtown Boston. And you see the emergence of the popular, very violent action of tarring and feathering royal officials. So customs officials who are complying with the Stamp Act face the violence of the mob. It's the Bostonian James Otis who introduces the term no taxation without representation. That is an anomaly, or really makes no sense to British parliamentary officials, because no one hardly in England has a direct vote. There are members of parliament and people vote in England, but usually it's the wealthier landowners. And often members of parliament represent districts that they don't even live in or don't even know the people. So they practice what was called virtual representation. There is a group of people who are somewhat voted on by the people who represent your interests. And this is how it is in England. The colonists are used to a much more direct representation, that they may actually know their representative in the colonial legislature. And so this saying of no taxation without representation means a lot more to them and makes a lot more sense than it does to parliamentary officials. The individual that attracts a lot of hatred and ire in Boston is Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who eventually becomes the governor. His house is ransacked at one point for his public support of the Stamp Act, even though privately he opposed it. In the South, in Virginia, Patrick Henry is a member of the House of Burgesses, emerged as one of the most vocal critics of these new parliamentary processes and taxes. And so he introduces into the Virginia legislature the Virginia Resolves of 1765, which declared Virginians were Britons who enjoyed the same rights, including self-taxation. The Parliament would be okay with that. Virginians can tax themselves through the House of Burgesses. The Parliament would be okay with that. But he also said the Virginia Assembly alone can tax Virginia. The Parliament would not be okay with that. So here, in some ways, is the crux of the argument between the Americans and the British Parliament, is who can tax these Americans. The Parliament maintains that they can. The Americans start to argue that only they can tax themselves. So in response to the Stamp Act, we have in 1765 the Stamp Act Congress. This is another attempt at colonial unity, as was the Albany Plan during the French and Indian War. This time, 27 delegates from 9 colonies meet. We still don't have representatives from all 13 colonies coming together. But once again, if you want to find the very embryonic origin of the United States Congress, you might see it in the Stamp Act Congress. Basically, the Stamp Act Congress declares a series of boycotts of English trade, and so it is the merchants themselves in England that are advocating for the Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766, which the Parliament does. But they also pass the Declaratory Act, which was really a empty gesture of asserting parliamentary authority against colonial resistance. The Parliament declares in the Declaratory Act that that body has the right to tax the Americans anytime that they want. Now, of course, they can declare that in law, but this is the very same year that the Parliament just backed down in the face of a large-scale colonial protest in the form of the Stamp Act Congress and the boycotts. In 1767, there is another attempt to tax the Americans, led by Charles Townshend, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's kind of like the Secretary of Treasury for the British Empire, which are known as the Townshend duties. This is a new series of taxes against lead, paint, tea, window panes, dice, playing cards, that particularly are going to anger some of the lower classes in colonial America. Some historians have pointed out that in order to lead an effective revolution, you need to organize and anger the lawyers of your society, and you also need to antagonize the lower class, the working class, those in the streets that will affect violence and accomplish your revolution. One group would be the brains and the other would be the brawn of a revolution, you might think of. And so the Stamp Act really angers the lawyers and the merchants and the well-to-do. And the Townsend duties is now angering the working class, a lot of whom are unemployed. There's a recession in the early 1770s in the American colonies. And so these sailors and dock workers who like to gamble, and of course all the Americans who like their tea, the Townsend duties are really angering them. So, learning their lesson from the first large-scale protests against the Stamp Act, the Americans once again resort to boycotts and non-importation, not buying British goods, not importing goods from British merchants. Instead, Americans start to make a lot of their own products, so they start to patch, fix, sew, reuse, recycle a lot of their own goods. You might also see here a bit of a stimulus towards American manufacturing, making them increasingly more self-sufficient and perhaps less reliant on England. Of course, the boycotts and the importation once again anger the merchants who are losing a lot of money in their sales to the Americans. And once again, it's the merchants, particularly in England, who are losing a lot of money from these colonial boycotts and non-importation, that protest to the Parliament directly for the repeal of the Townsend duties and the resumption of trade. And so as a result, the Parliament revokes the Townsend duties in 1770, all of the duties on all of the items except tea. But the price of imperial tea is still higher than the smuggled price, and therefore the colonial protest is muted. As an indicator of the rising tension between the Americans and the now quartered British troops in a lot of their homes, we see in March of 1770 the events that lead to the Boston Massacre. There were some British soldiers that were seeking additional work, and they faced the ire of the Bostonians, and so a shouting match and throwing snowballs and rocks at British soldiers descends eventually into violence in front of the old State House in Boston, in which very anxious and nervous British soldiers fire into the crowd purposefully or inadvertently, and when the smoke clears, 5 Americans have been shot. It's John Adams, the Boston young lawyer, who volunteers to defend the British soldiers, and as a result gets many of them acquitted or with very light sentences. In 1772, we also see a measure of violence here in the Gaspé affair. The Gaspé was a British naval ship that hunted down smugglers and boarded their ships and seized their smuggled goods, arresting the smugglers. And the Gaspé runs aground off the coast of Rhode Island. And so in the middle of the night, some Rhode Islanders row out and burn the Gaspé to the waterline, indicating additional violence here. Amidst all these protests and boycotts, the Americans begin an extensive letter writing campaign that becomes known as the Committees of Correspondence. This is another example of how slowly but surely the Americans slowly are starting to communicate with each other. And despite the absence of quality roads and the difficulty of traveling from New England to the southern colonies, apart from taking a ship down the Atlantic seaboard, gradually the colonies are starting to think of themselves as together in this oppression by the British Parliament, and therefore start to correspond with each other. Perhaps the turning event in the move of the American colonists from simple resistance to outright rebellion may occur in 1773. In that year, the East India Company, one of these large government corporations that was responsible for overseeing trade with the very valuable colony of India to the east, is more or less bankrupt. It's a government corporation. It's been poorly run. It hasn't been achieving a profit for years. It's been running high deficits. And so in an effort to bail out the East India Company, the Parliament grants it a special favor, which is the East India Company does not have to move through additional British ports to sell its tea to the American colonies, it can, in a sense, cut out the middleman. As a result, the tea coming from India can now come all the way to the American colonies and be sold at a reduced price. The price is so reduced, it's actually less than the price that smugglers such as John Hancock can sell the tea. So as a result, in late 1773, 3 ships arrive at Griffin's Dock in Boston, the Eleanor, the Dartmouth, and the Beaver, loaded down with approximately 300 chests of tea. If this tea is unloaded, the taxes will be paid, and as a result, the British will score a win here. And so the local Sons of Liberty, under the leadership of Sam Adams, meet at the Old South Meeting House, which was a congregational church. They meet inside at least 1,000 members, and the signal is given to walk down to Griffin's Dock, and with a prearranged plan, the Sons of Liberty dress like Mohawk Indians and throw the tea into the sea. This represents the destruction of some very valuable property here of the East India Company. This is one of the only remaining chests of tea from that event, and in Boston they actually have some of the actual tea from the Boston Tea Party. Needless to say, the Parliament is furious, and so it takes some time for word to get across the ocean, and then for the Parliament to make a decision and then announce it back in the colonies, and when they do, they drop the hammer on these rebels in Boston in the form of the Coercive Acts. The Bostonians and the colonists will call these the Intolerable Acts, but they are the same acts, the Coercive Acts and the Intolerable Acts. The Port of Boston is closed until the money is paid to reimburse for the destroyed tea. That is, of course, economically devastating to Boston and the colony of Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Government Act disbanded the Massachusetts Assembly. So now the citizens of Boston see a direct attack against their ability to be self-governing Englishmen. The Impartial Justice Act required royal officials to be tried in England, and the Quartering Act meant that more British troops are going to be sent to these American colonies. This is the first time that clearly the Parliament is getting serious, and they are willing to impose very stringent restrictions and punishments on the Americans. Not part of the coercive or intolerable acts, but issued at the same time, and to the colonists it felt like it was also part of their punishment, was the Quebec Act of 1774. You remember all those French citizens that, despite France losing the French and Indian War, these French citizens still lived to the north in Quebec, and the Parliament grants them initial access to the very valuable land of the Ohio Valley, which the American colonists did not yet have access to. By dictate of the proclamation line, they weren't supposed to cross the Appalachian Mountains. So now these French Catholics to the north are going to have access first to the very valuable farmland of the Ohio River Valley, which further angers the Americans. As a result, in 1774, the First Continental Congress convenes. Still, not all of the colonies send representatives. No one is really talking about independence or revolution. It is simply a meeting to defend themselves and also to form an additional and new colonial protest against the Coercive Acts, and also to support the people of Boston and Massachusetts with goods being shipped from all over the colonies to support them in their time of need while their port is closed. This is a picture of the first prayer in Congress. As a result, a whole bunch of additional troops, about 1,000 British troops now, are occupying downtown Boston. It's an armed city. Martial law is imposed. They are camped on the Boston Common, and they are under the command of General Thomas Gage. Gage is concerned that 2 of the biggest rebels, John Hancock and Sam Adams, are somewhere in the interior of Massachusetts, perhaps fomenting rebellion. They are the most vocal voices of colonial protest in Massachusetts, and if they could be arrested and silenced, then perhaps things would die down. So as a result, Gage orders his men to leave their encampment on the Boston Common and head to the west to the towns of Lexington and Concord to arrest Adams and Hancock. Now, this is the worst kept secret in the colonies. Paul Revere, who's a local silversmith, hears of this and conducts his very famous midnight ride after seeing two lanterns in the belfry of the Old North Church. He knows that the British are coming by sea after seeing the lanterns, so as a result, Paul Revere crosses the Charles River and then mounts his horse with his assistant William Dawes and then head west to the towns of Lexington and Concord, warning every Middlesex town and farm that indeed the British are coming, the regulars are out. He does not say the British are coming, as is the legend. Of course, everyone is British. He says the regulars out. The regular troops are coming. And so the Minutemen, who are supposed to be ready in a minute, local farmers, militiamen who once in a while would muster or form together to practice some drilling. This is certainly the furthest thing from a professional army. Meet the British troops at Lexington Green under the command of Captain John Parker. It is in this tavern that Hancock and Adams are dining, and when they hear that the regulars are coming, they load into a carriage and drive away. So it is at Lexington Green the first shots are indeed fired, that once again, when the Minutemen refuse to disperse upon the orders of the British troops and slowly start to sulk away, someone fires a shot from the British ranks. The Americans return fire. The British take the field, take the Lexington Green, but nevertheless, the shots have been fired. Now the British men are fighting British men here, and clearly things have escalated to a point of violence. There's additional conflict all the way to Concord, and particularly over the famous bridge in which the Americans resist the British advance. The British are unable to find Hancock and Adams. They find very little in the way of ammunition, muskets, or a cannon. And so as a result, the British are harassed all the way back in their journey to Boston. They're exhausted. They're low on water and ammunition. And the Americans harass them all along this battlefield road going from Concord all the way to Boston, which is an all-night march for them. So now the shooting has started. There is no independence declared. Most people are still not talking about forming an independent country, but clearly the Americans are arming themselves. We also see that with the capture of guns at Fort Ticonderoga, which are dragged to Boston, and these same guns are set up on the heights of Charlestown, Breed's Hill in Charlestown, which is this peninsula to the north of downtown Boston, also in Dorchester Heights, which is to the south of Boston. And so this leads to the Battle of Bunker Hill, just 2 months after Lexington and Concord in June 1775, when the British once again tried to dislodge the Americans from their position on what was Breed's Hill, but will become known as Bunker Hill by a British map error. So the Americans hold the high ground. 3 times the British march up the hill. The first 2 times they're forced to retreat. The American fire is too great, but by the 3rd attempt up the hill, the Americans have run out of ammunition, are forced to give up their redoubts at the top of the hill, and the British take the hill. However, we would call the Battle of Bunker Hill a Pyrrhic victory for the British because they sustained close to 1,000 losses for capturing a hill that is of little significance. And so in July of 1775, the Olive Branch Petition is issued. This is one of these last-ditch attempts in order to avoid war. The Olive Branch Petition, signed by, among others, John Hancock and Thomas Jefferson, was a proposal that the Americans would be loyal to the king, but they would tax themselves. This is rejected by the Parliament. The Parliament doesn't want to seem to be weak, and neither does the king. And as a result, it doesn't seem like war is going to be avoided. So the British evacuate Boston because they're still surrounded by guns to the south. realizing that Boston is a hotbed of resentment and rebellion. And then, very significantly, in the following year, in January 1776, Thomas Paine publishes the most consequential pamphlet for the coming of the American Revolution, which is Common Sense. In this pamphlet, which is very popular in the colonies, hundreds of thousands of copies are published and read. It is common sense, Paine says, that an island cannot govern a continent, and the Americans are self-sufficient and should declare their independence from this king. For the first time, you get a very vocal public voice critical of the king. Previous to this, the Americans would also always be very specific that they were concerned about the evil ministers who are influencing the king, or criticize the parliament. They would never actually criticize King George III himself. However, George III is supportive of what the parliament is doing in their policy towards the Americans, and so Paine redirects the argument and the criticism not just against evil advisors or the parliament, but actually against the king himself. So that summer, when the Second Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia once again, it is Richard Henry Lee of Virginia who makes a motion that these colonies ought to be free and independent states. A committee of 5 is appointed for the drafting of a statement that will declare independence. It is to the young lawyer from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, that the task is assigned to write this document under the supervision of John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. And this, of course, is the Declaration of Independence, which is voted and signed and proclaimed on July 4th, 1776. Josiah Bartlett, who lived briefly in my own hometown, was also one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And so, finally, these colonies that had no intention of declaring their independence at the beginning of the colonial protest now indeed are their own countries. So there are movements against signs of British authority and royal power throughout the colonies, including the pulling down of a statue of King George III in New York City. And this statue will be melted down and used for musket balls in the course of the American Revolution. Now, not everyone in the colonies supports this revolution. Somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the American colonists are known as loyalists. They want to be loyal to the parliament and to the king. And so as a result, they are caught in between the revolutionaries in America and British imperial policy. The response of the loyalists is varied. Some of them are quite persecuted, harassed, have their possessions and houses and land seized in the course of the American Revolution. They're viewed as spies amidst this revolution. Many of them flee to Nova Scotia and eventually will also make their way to French Louisiana. Some of them will go to England, where, of course, they feel like strangers because they were born in England and never lived in England as well. But nevertheless, in the conducting this revolution, the Americans always feel that there is a disloyal bunch, perhaps spies, in their midst in the form of the Loyalists. So, with the Declaration of Independence, we can now talk about the American Revolutionary War itself. This is when the war essentially is official. Of course, the shooting started the previous year at Lexington and Concord and also at Bunker Hill. But clearly, as of July 4, 1776, these American colonies are in a state of rebellion, and it leads to warfare from 1776 really to 1781. The fighting dies down, but the peace treaty isn't signed until 1783. I'm going to emphasize the important parts in this review video and skip over a lot of the military history, which is usually not in large numbers on the AP national exam. So you ought to be familiar with the two sides going into this war. This really is a David versus Goliath conflict. There's really no reason the Americans should have won this war. They are up against enormous odds. The British Army is the best equipped, best trained, best resourced, most experienced army in the world. They have the best uniforms and boots. They've been drilled, they've been trained, they've had experience in other colonies, including India and also the Caribbean, in putting down rebellions. They have the best firepower, they have the best navy. They have the full support of the parliament behind them. They have every advantage, it would seem, going into this conflict. The Americans have very little. They don't have a navy to speak of. They have a collection of militia. There really is no Continental Army. They don't really have too many experienced commanders. They will always be short on uniforms and on shoes and boots, ammunition, food, winter clothing, lodging, and sometimes the support of the local population. What the American army does have is morale. There is a cause célèbre in leading this revolution. They have morale. The British army does not. And that is a pivotal feature here. The British are fighting on foreign soil to a population that generally doesn't want them. The Americans generally are fighting on home court. They know these fields, these forests. They know the terrain. And generally, they have the support of the local population. And that's a key decisive factor. What the Americans also have is George Washington, and it's difficult to overstate his significance. He is one of the very few experienced in leading armies, and therefore he's given overall command of the Continental Army. It is his humility and his ability to inspire his men to endure great odds and great deprivations that is so pivotal for the colonial cause. The greatest thing that Washington does is that he knows how to retreat. He does not continually fight in a pitched battle the British army because he knows he's outgunned, outmanned, out-resourced, and out-trained. What he does is harass, ambush, and retreat. Harass, ambush, and retreat. Harass, ambush, and retreat. And he does this extensively, particularly in the war in the North, in which the British chased him all around Staten Island, Manhattan, up into the Bronx, all the way down into New Jersey. The two charismatic commanders for the war in the North, the ground troops, are led by William Howe, and the naval forces that pull into New York Harbor are led by his brother, Admiral Richard Howe. So once again, the British have control of the seas and also the ground, given the fact of their large army. So Washington, after the Battle of Long Island, harasses the British and then retreats all the way down to New Jersey. The British have also hired to do some of their fighting Hessian or Prussian mercenaries, soldiers paid for hire from Germany that were known as very ruthless fighters. So after chasing Washington all the way down into New Jersey, the British settle in December 25th, Christmas Day, of 1776, and Washington breaks the protocols of war by attacking the British not exactly on Christmas Day, but just a few hours after the end of Christmas Day, in the middle of the night, the Battle of Trenton. This is one of Washington's few victories. He's going to lose more battles than he wins, and he defeats the British at Trenton. To the north, the Americans score a significant victory. The plan for the British was to have a three-pronged attack against an American army in upstate New York, led by three different generals. However, two of those generals never actually land their troops and start to march towards the rendezvous position. That leads just General John Burgoyne to face a substantial American army under the command of General Horatio Gates and General Benedict Arnold. And the result is devastating for the British who are oversupplied and traveling with too much of a baggage train, and also with wives and girlfriends and mistresses and so forth, moving very slowly. A very cumbersome army is overwhelmed by the Americans. The Americans score a major, significant victory at the Battle of Saratoga. This is one of the battles that you should be familiar with going into the AP exam, because it's frequently asked, what is the significance of the Battle of Saratoga of 1778? It is not simply a military victory, but the real significance of the victory at the Battle of Saratoga is that the French realize the Americans actually may pull this off. And maybe with the support of French troops, French training and experience, money, and particularly the French Navy, the two could combine and beat the British, and the French could get some revenge for losing the French and Indian War. So the Marquis de Lafayette, one of the most popular Frenchmen to resource Washington and to train troops, is one of the best gifts from France the Americans received during their revolution. So General Howe camps down in the city of Philadelphia during a long, cold winter. He is taken by the opera and shows and the ladies of Philadelphia. Meanwhile, Washington is drilling his troops under very adverse conditions a couple dozen miles to the west at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. And while Howe is partying, Washington is drilling and training and really forming his army, his loose collection of militia, into a real army. That is the long-term significance of Valley Forge, that it is a loose collection of militia that goes into Valley Forge at the beginning of the winter, and what emerges is an army ready to fight. A lot of that has to do with Washington's inspiration, but also Baron von Steuben, a Prussian drill master who trains the colonial troops at Valley Forge, and also Thaddeus Kościuszko, who is a Polish engineer who trains the Americans how to build fortifications, earthworks, redoubts, and so forth. So the war takes place in the north, and then the war moves to the south in 1778 with battles at Monmouth that involved the very famous Molly Pitcher. We also see the betrayal of Benedict Arnold, who thought that he should have had more command like Washington, that Washington was getting too much credit and he wasn't getting enough praise. And so as a result, he endeavors to betray the location and fortifications of the West Point position on the Hudson River through a British agent named John Andre. The plot is uncovered. Arnold escapes, but he earns the everlasting contempt of his countrymen for betraying the American cause. Arnold will die in bankruptcy and loneliness and infamy in England, where he is not trusted at all. So the British, believing that there is larger loyalist support in the South, initiate a large-scale campaign in the South. They occupy Charleston under the command of General Henry Clinton, and Charleston is going to endure a siege for the remaining years of the war. There are often violent battles between loyalists and American soldiers, such as the Battle of Kings Mountain in 1780. Some actual American victories against the British, such as the Battle of Cowpens. And General Cornwallis endeavors to track down the American army in the South and destroy it. The American army in the South is led by Nathaniel Greene. And Greene leads Cornwallis on hundreds of miles of treks into the Carolina wilderness, into its forests throughout South and North Carolina, harassing Cornwallis's troops at every turn. So Greene takes a page out of Washington's strategy books here and fights the British in very few pitched battles, but is constantly running away. And then when the British pause, then the Americans would attack them. We also see in the Southern campaign, particularly in South Carolina, the emergence of Francis Marion, the swamp fox, who harasses British troops from his positions in the swamps of South Carolina. South Carolinians who view Francis Marion as a hero will eventually move to Florida after the war and name their county Marion County after Francis Marion. Finally, Cornwallis essentially gives up in chasing Nathaniel Greene and moves to the Chesapeake region, hoping to be picked up by the British troops and reassigned. He makes the very foolish move of retreating on the Yorktown Peninsula. And so the significance of retreating on the Yorktown Peninsula is that he is essentially surrounded by the sea and the landforms of the peninsula. The very cagey Washington sees the opportunity here now as the war moves to the center or the middle states, the Chesapeake area. And so as a result, the French fleet now arrives under the command of Admiral de Barras and block the British fleet from entering the Chesapeake Bay. And so the British troops under Cornwallis are surrounded on the Yorktown Peninsula. They cannot retreat to the sea. And then Washington lays siege to Cornwallis's position at Yorktown, surrounding him and shelling him. And so as a result, in 1781, a major victory. This is the last significant battle of the American Revolution. Washington earns Cornwallis's surrender. This really indicates that the British are not going to win this war. There is very little public support for the continuance of the American Revolution in England. A lot of historians have compared the British experience in the Americas during the American Revolution as the American experience in Vietnam. That there is a local population that does not support this occupying imperial perhaps invading force. And so the British fighting over terrain they're not familiar with, being harassed by a poorly trained enemy through sabotage and ambush, eventually leads to very little support. The merchants in England are just begging for the end of this war, for Parliament to end the war, sign a peace treaty so that trade can resume with the Americans. That is what is achieved finally in 1783. Benjamin Franklin and others, including John Adams, have been in Paris negotiating with the English for an end to the war, which is finally secured in 1783. By the terms of the Treaty of Paris, Great Britain acknowledges the independence of the United States. So against all odds, what was not believed could happen, indeed is secured with American independence. The boundaries are established all the way to the Mississippi River, also to Canada to the north, and then the line will extend south to Spanish Florida. Fishing rights are granted to the United States. This new United States government will promise to return confiscated lands to the Loyalists, and also the return by both sides of prisoners of war, and then both sides will have mutual access to the Mississippi River. So, an extraordinary event that the Americans actually secure their revolution. So much of it has to do with the colonial protest, the boycotts of British goods, the enormous economic losses that the British are experiencing, the unpopularity of the War of Britain, but also in General Washington and his successful strategy of continuing to retreat. And so here is Washington after he has secured the independence of his now new country. He resigns his commission, surrendering his sword to the Congress, and believing that he is about to enter into retirement.